and she was 14, was not the woman with whom he had relations and with whom he had children. Furthermore, he actually argued against race mixing because, so he claimed, black people were inferior to whites in body and mind. So it's not very likely that Jefferson or Washington were viewed as heroes by their slaves, or that their slaves would have mounted any monuments to them. But at least Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Jefferson did not even Sally Hemings. Winston Churchill was a proud and unreconstructed imperialist and a racist, and his policy choices and decisions as the unquestionably heroic Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II nevertheless caused the deaths in Bengal of several million Indians due to starvation. India was, of course, a colony of Britain then. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that if some academic or researcher from Canada or Germany or Poland were to come to the United States or Great Britain and in all sincerity advise, respectively, us Americans or the British to take down our monuments and statues to Washington, Jefferson, or Churchill, I think we all know what their response would be. It would be laughter, and if the academic still pressed his or her advice, he or she would be told to go fly a kite or something perhaps less diplomatic. But that expected outcome is already baked into the cake of expectations, which is why no one, whether from Canada or Germany or wherever, has attempted or is likely to try and attempt to tell us or the British whom we should commemorate. When today's Ukrainians want to commemorate the Ukrainian underground, why do they want to honor it? For its mistakes or the mistakes of its members, or for exhibiting under the most difficult of circumstances the courage, self-sacrifice, and extraordinary dedication of many of those members to the effort to help preserve Ukrainian identity and achieve subjecthood for Ukrainians. Professor Himkin and some of his colleagues, as well as some in Poland and Israel, seem to think that they are entitled to impose upon Ukrainians their definitions of how to understand the Ukrainian underground. But that would be like foreigners insisting to us Americans that by commemorating Jefferson or Washington, we are in fact endorsing racism and slavery, and therefore that we need to tear down the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. Ukrainians have the right to decide how they view and define their own history. Obviously, neither Ukrainians nor anyone else has the right to manufacture a history, much less to try to impose that manufactured history on its neighbors or the rest of the world. And Ukrainians have the right to choose why it is, or for what actions they memorialize any given individual, movement, or organization. None of this should be controversial, but surprisingly, it often is presented as though it were. Thank you for your attention.
So our next speaker is Alexander Motet, who needs no introduction, but he was a professor at Rutgers and is now teaching at Columbia University and is well known as a political scientist and a commentator on current events.
My apologies for being so late. I was persuaded that this event began at 6 o'clock. And then at exactly 4:59, I looked into my events planner and it said 5 p.m. Fortunately, I live 5 blocks away. So in any case, I mean, it's very hard after such a brilliant presentation to say anything very original. So let me start with a reminiscence and then proceed to make a number of points that will be somewhat different and perhaps complementary to what Dr. Vitvitsky said. I first got involved in studying Ukrainian nationalism in college in my junior and senior years. So this is a fairly long time ago, 1974, 75. And then when I lived in Vienna in 1977, 78, I worked on what eventually became my first book. It was called The Turn to the Right, The Ideological Origins and Development of Ukrainian Nationalism from 1919 to 1929. That came out in 1980 or something like that. And received pretty good reviews. I remember when I was researching the book, researching the material for the book, and I was drawing primarily on original sources found in the Viennese archives, library, and places like that. I was struck by the fact that there were, well, first of all, that there was almost no serious English language, or for that matter, any kind of language literature other than Ukrainian, on the nationalist movement. There was a book by John Armstrong, published in 1950-51, thereabouts, called Ukrainian Nationalism, which is still a very good book. Yaroslav Belinsky devoted 1 or 2 chapters on that in his book on the Second Soviet Republic, Ukraine after World War II. Poles had written a number of things. As far as I recall, nothing comes to mind from the German perspective. Roman Ilnitsky wrote a 2-volume set on the Ukrainian liberation movement in Germany, but that was in German, written by Ukrainian. Anyway, so in terms of scholarship, very little. Again, I'm sure I've missed a number of things in my recounting, but very little. There was a fair amount written in support of the movement, primarily in Ukrainian by people who supported the movement. A lot of that happened to be memoirs, which were usually very interesting. And a lot of it was hagiography, sort of heroization. And of course, the Soviets produced a fair amount of stuff, but it was generally of the propaganda, sort of unvarnished propaganda. Some of you may recall there used to be a section in the journal, I believe it was Zhovtin, which was published, I believe, by the Lviv Writers Union. But in any case, it was called Post imени Yaroslava Halana. And it printed articles of various kinds denouncing the nationalists for all sorts of sins. The Ukrainian Society, Tvarstvo Ukraina, would always publish little brochures about the fascists in the ranks. The werewolves in Munich, these sorts of lurid titles. It's fun to read, by the way. So if you ever have an opportunity, you could go for them. And it's the sort of thing that would have been published by the Ukrainian communists on 4th Street in those days. Anyway, to move to the current period, I mean, obviously the number of works on Ukraine in general and Ukrainian nationalism in particular has grown immensely. It's no longer what it was when I was writing this book. Now you can actually draw on 10, 20, 30, 40 scholarly books dealing with Ukraine, or semi-scholarly books dealing with Ukraine. A slew of articles, obviously in English, but also in German. And of course, most importantly, an enormous amount has been written by Ukrainian scholars, young and old, dealing with this. And that is, of course, the one part that was missing altogether, because the Ukrainians were disenfranchised, had no vote, and voice, and vote, and couldn't say much of anything in terms of their scholarship. Let me just jump to some of the issues, using this as background, jump to some of the issues raised by Dr. Witwicki. He talks about the vilifiers. They actually refer to themselves as revisionists. The idea being that there's a mainstream, which is presumably a nationalist, an apologetic, hagiographic, and so on, and they are the ones who are breaking the mold. This is actually one of the first, if not the first, misinterpretation that they engage in. I'll give you a bunch of others, and of course you've heard a substantive analysis of this from Dr. Witwicki. In point of fact, their argumentation, their articles and books differ in no significant way from the articles and books that were published by the Ukrainian Society and the Post imени Yaroslava Halana. All right, it's not a scholarship, it's propaganda. Now, the difference is that Soviets, well, again, I'm not even sure it's a difference, because the Soviets actually used archival materials. So it wasn't as if they were making things up completely. They were making up, a quarter, a third, 10%, 20%, but they tended to make up a certain amount. But then, of course, at the same time, there was something resembling a more or less solid reference to particular archives that, of course, were inaccessible to us, but one had to assume that there might be some kernel of truth in them. And we see the same thing in the writings of the so-called vilifiers. They obviously have done a lot of homework, but at the same time, they also engage in misrepresentations, omissions, outright lies, in order to make their point. And of course, that makes it difficult to argue against them because 75–80% of what they're writing is more or less okay, but then it's the important 10 or 20% that one may not be able to see offhand unless you're an expert who follows these things. And of course, this sounds like Putin's propaganda as well, right? It sounds like anybody's propaganda, come to think of it. Anyway, I would say that in point of fact, the vilifiers are not revisionists because the mainstream was Soviet propaganda. The post-Imeni Halana, that was the mainstream understanding of Ukrainian nationalism. They by far outnumbered what was being written in the immigration and the diaspora in terms of books and articles. I don't mean newspaper articles. So in effect, they are not revisionists. They are continuing the time-honored tradition of Soviet propaganda. Right? At the same time, I would sort of the opposite side, 180 degrees opposed to them, are the Ukrainians in the diaspora as well as in Ukraine, who are essentially apologists, right? Who are seeking for heroes and finding heroes, and doing that in a very similar kind of manner. They too ground their analyses in facts. They've done their homework, but then there's that suspicious 10 or 20%. It just happens to be a different 10 or 20%. The real revisionists are the people who were trying to provide a balanced view in the manner that Dr. Vitsitsky was illuminating. They're trying to suggest that things were complicated. It wasn't simply a question of a procurator making a case for the guilt of a victim and a defense attorney arguing and misquoting and misusing facts in order to argue for innocence. That's not what scholarship is about. It's supposed to be about something called the truth, whatever that is. But in any case, we know what it's not. And neither of those two extremes were engaging in genuine scholarship. It was essentially a form of propaganda. Soviet on the one side, anti-Soviet on the other side. And what the true revisionists are doing, people like Patriarch, people like the two gentlemen sitting on the panel, they're trying to show the nationalist movement in all of its complexities. Back in the 1960s, I believe there was a short book written by Lev Gravit called Svitla I Tini Oun. And I think that's the point. The point of scholarship is to show the pluses and the minuses within a broader social, economic, and international context. Make these pluses and minuses understandable and comprehensible. So rather than focusing only on the pluses or only on the minuses, we combine both into something resembling a coherent, fair, even-handed, non-apologetic, non-propaganda narrative. That's not hard to do. People do that all the time. Go to Barnes & Noble and look at the history section, and you'll find first-class histories of all sorts of periods of history. But in this particular case, it's hard to do because the topic is so politicized. Obviously on the part of the critics, but also on the part of the apologists. And it's full of minefields, it's full of all sorts of problematic issues. But the way out of this is to be even-handed. The way out of this is not to misquote, is not to misrepresent, is not to lie, but take into consideration both the pluses and the minuses, look at them in context, look at them over time, and also be attentive to comparison. Because it's never just sufficient to study anything on its own. invariably we missee things, right? It's always important and useful to see things in comparison to other things, to look for similarities and identities. And I'll come back to this point in a second. Anyway, let me just give you a few more examples of the really preposterous and kind of earth-shatteringly crude misrepresentations that I've encountered in studying the vilifiers or in reading the vilifiers. I don't study them anymore. Life is too short. You may recall a number of years ago, the biography, the so-called biography of Velikovsky, which he delivered while being imprisoned by the Nazis. And in this so-called biography, he says that he supports Nazi policies towards racism, Jews, and so on. Immediately, this is expanded and drummed up as acknowledgement of the fact that he was obviously a Nazi. Clearly, how could you conclude anything else with that? Again, I have no idea. Perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. I'm not here to defend him. I'm here to quote to underline the misrepresentation of this quote. You do not take seriously the statements made under duress. Here's a guy who's just been arrested, who's about to be sent into a concentration camp, who has some presumed knowledge of both Soviet and Nazi methods, and who is probably, possibly, or maybe not, but possibly willing to say anything in order not to get into trouble. In other words, this document, which may or may not be authentic, but in any case, let's assume it's authentic, is proof of nothing. Now, again, this isn't to say that Stitchko may or may not have had those sorts of inclinations. I don't know, and for present purposes, I don't care. But you don't use this kind of document for this kind of purpose. The most you can say is, well, he said this, but we don't know what it means. And we don't know what it means. Another example, Wendy Lauer, another Holocaust historian, again, not a Ukrainian, obviously, you can tell from the name, cites a quotation from Dmytro Dontsov, which he made in 1924 in a journal that he then edited called Zahrava. It's a quotation that I actually quoted in my book. And the quotation reads something to the following effect. The Jews are responsible for everything that transpired, for all the losses of the revolution, but the major amount of responsibility and fault goes to the Moskali. All right? So everybody's at fault. She quotes, and she cites me as a source. This is the thing. She quotes the first part with a period.
No.
But there is no period. There's a comma after which Dontsov says, but the true fault, the true responsibility lies with the Russians. You don't do that kind of thing. This is simply unconscionable. Another example, famous article written by John Paul Himka on the Lviv pogrom of 1941.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is a question of context as raised by Dr. Bitvitsky. You cannot understand the Lviv pogrom without understanding the fact that immediately before withdrawing from Lviv and more generally Western Ukraine, the NKVD massacred somewhere between 20 and 25,000 Ukrainian political prisoners in a slew of prisons and camps. Several thousand were killed in Lviv, hundreds in many other places, but it was close to 25. Ksenia Kebuzinska and I, we actually co-edited a volume containing materials documenting this so-called West Ukrainian massacre, as we called it. This is like, again, this is like ignoring 9/11 while writing about the invasion of Iraq. Surely the massacre, and remember, this massacre takes place in the course of about 7 days, starting in Lemkivshchina and ending with Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk. This massacre goes in several waves. At the height of summer, bodies are decaying, There is a stench in the city. People come in to these prisons, and they find their relatives mutilated before and possibly after having been killed. My mother even told me about this. She came from a small town, Nationalism, which had 77,000 people, about 10% of whom 700 were Ukrainian. And she said as soon as the Soviets withdrew, everybody ran to the local prison, and it was shut. No one was in the cells. And then someone pointed to the fact that the ground behind the prison was soft and steamy. And they uncovered 22 corpses, one of whom happened to be an uncle of mine. And this Himka, in his article, mentions this in one sentence. This is unconscionable. You simply can't do this. You simply cannot do this kind of thing. There is talk as well, again, one finds this in a variety of articles and books, that the Ukrainian nationalists had an anti-Semitic discourse. I've read a number, I believe 2 articles on these. Now, I don't know what you think of when you hear the word discourse, but when I use the word discourse, it means a way of talking about something or other. There's a language, there's a logic, all right? And it's widespread, right? We could say that there is a Shevchenko discourse amongst Ukrainian diaspora, right? Because we're always talking about Shevchenko. These articles, when they talk about the anti-Semitic discourse, they invariably cite the same 10, maybe 15 articles and brochures written in the course of about 35 years. 10 articles or brochures written in the course of 35 years ain't no discourse. That's 10 or 15 articles written in the course of 35 years. They may reveal something about their authors. They say absolutely nothing about the so-called discourse, right? If anything, there was a discourse of nationalism in Western Ukraine. Clearly, we can agree on that. There may have been a discourse regarding some kind of attitudes of hostility towards Poles, Russians, and Jews. But to use these particular bits of evidence as evidence of an existing discourse is simply nonsensical. And no respectable historian would do that in any other field. And more important, no respectable historian in any other field would get away with it. But in this field, anything goes. As long as you press the right buttons and you say the right words, everything goes, as long as you're on the side of the angels and not the so-called devils. I'll give you one more example. This isn't so much a question of misinterpretation as of perhaps naivete. The number of Jews killed in the Lviv pogrom of July 1941. You look at the existing literature, the memoirs and so on, and the number is usually given as about 2, 3, 4,000. You know, this is serious, right? 2,000 is really serious. Of course, anybody's death in a pogrom would be serious, but 2,000 is very serious. A couple of years ago, a German scholar by the name of Kai Struve looked at the actual sources that were continually being cited and decided, or concluded rather, that many of them simply were unreliable. And he came up with the number of about 200-300. Now he's German. Germans aren't exactly Ukraine friendly, at least when it comes to Ukrainian nationalism. So the fact that he says it's not 2,000, let's say it's 200, is significant, right? Just recently, a Ukrainian scholar by the name of Anatoly Klitschko did a very sustained, very detailed analysis of the sources. It was even more detailed than that engaged in by Struve. And he concludes that we can at best say with certainty that maybe 75 Jews were killed. Now, 75, 200 basically is the same ballpark figure. Much, again, too many. And it's a shame and it's a scandal that this occurred. And we should acknowledge that. But at the same time, it's not 2,000. But you look at the literature and no one ever questions that number. Because, of course, it fits that discourse. You see, ironically, the discourse that is supposed to exist amongst Ukrainians doesn't really exist. But the discourse that is claimed not to exist, the one amongst the vilifiers, does in fact exist. There is, in a way, a kind of blueprint on what to do and how to write, whom to criticize and what words to use in order to make a particular vilifying point. Final point. One of the things that just mystifies me is people ask, what is the true nature of the Ukrainian nationalist movement? And of course, the true nature of the Ukrainian nationalist movement is self-evident in the name. It should be nationalism, right? And it is. And I would suggest that we should take the nationalists seriously, whether they're Mazzini, the IRA, the Palestinians, the Jews, or the Ukrainians, or the Vietnamese. When they call themselves nationalists, they say that for a reason, because they are nationalists, which is to say, as Dr. Vivitsky pointed out in a number of his citations, that they support independent statehood for their nations. Mm-hmm. That is fundamentally the core of nationalism. Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainians were no different from the Jews or the Palestinians or the Irish or the Vietnamese or the Algerians or the Italians or the Germans or the Poles and so on. If you look at the record of the Polish party, Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, the Polish Socialist Party, before World War I, they committed something like 250 assassinations. They robbed banks and post offices. Compared to the Polish nationalist movement headed by none other than Józef Piłsudski, the future dictator and president, right, of Poland, the hero whose statue stands in central Warsaw, the Ukrainian nationalists were little boys and girls. I once calculated that they killed something like 40 or 50 people in the course of 20 years. These guys did 250. Again, I don't know if that's good or bad. That's for you to decide. My point is, if you're going to vilify one, well, we may as well vilify all of them. Nationalists do good things, like fight for their sovereignty and so on, but they often employ violence. That's in the nature of the beast. When you're challenging an existing state, even more so when you're challenging an existing international system, such as Ukrainians were challenging, you will meet with the violence of that state. And good or bad, right or wrong, Christian or non-Christian, I'm not making a moral judgment here, the tendency amongst nationalists, and indeed amongst peoples, look at Ukraine today, is to respond to violence with violence. That's a sad fact, and we prefer it to be otherwise, but it happens to be the truth. Final point about nationalism. Nationalists are often violent, that's true, but again, it's not because they are inherently, innately violent beasts. They just use these means in order to achieve their ends, given the complexity of the situation, right? But what is striking about nationalism, the doctrine, the ideology of aligning a nation with its own independent state, is that it is compatible with just about any kind of regime. There are communist nationalists, mm-hmm. There are Muslim nationalists, there are Catholic nationalists, there are Protestant nationalists, there are fascist nationalists, there are liberal nationalists, there are democratic nationalists. And when you look at the Ukrainian experience, the Ukrainian nationalist experience, you look at them in the 1920s, they were by and large non-democratic, more or less anti-democratic, but not quite authoritarian. In the 1930s, they become more explicitly authoritarian. Late 30s, I'm not sure I'd call them fascist even then, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that for 2 years, they flirted with fascism. 1943, they suddenly adopt a democratic socialist program. And they retained that until 1955, when the entire movement is eliminated in Ukraine. Vilifiers often refer to this as opportunism. No, they were doing what all nationalists do, right? There is no one regime type that has to go with an independent state. You can have a democratic independent state, and you can have a totalitarian independent state. It all depends on the volition of the nationalists and the people. And the Ukrainian nationalists, in their ideological evolution, right, essentially exhibited precisely that point, okay? I'll end on that, except to suggest to you that there is a book that just came out, edited by Serhiy Yakelchik, called Ireland and Ukraine. I've just begun reading it, so I can't say that it's a great book or not a great book, but the mere fact that he and a whole slew of authors, there are about 30 authors, that they are comparing Ukraine with Ireland and not with Nazi Germany and not with fascist Italy is already an important step forward. I would like to see a comparison of the Ukrainian nationalist movement with the Black civil rights movement in this country. And that would really be something. Дякую вам за вашу увагу.
Well, those are two great presentations, and we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is keep it very short. Essentially, I'm just going to make a few comments to these two wonderful presentations. First of all, in Ukraine today, everything is being fused into one narrative, a narrative of national liberation struggle. And there's a lot to be said for that. From the time of the revolution, 1917 to 1920, through the 1920s, the Ukrainianization policy, the struggle against Stalin, the Second World War, right through the dissident movements of the present day. There is a drive for national liberation. We can agree with that. But can we fold all of these movements, all of these groups into the same fold? Does the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, differ? I want to look at three controversial issues. They've been looked at a little bit in these talks, but these are the issues that come up most often when the OUN is mentioned. The OUN in the 30s was roundly criticized by Ukrainian society, by Democrats, by parliamentarians, by the church, by community leaders for its assassination not only of Poles, Soviet officials, but also of Ukrainians, for its robberies, for its cult of violence. And as Sheptytsky and other, Metropolitan Sheptytsky and others said, they were turning youth into gangsters. One has to bear in mind the fact that they were a minority, 8,000 or 9,000 people prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, I realize that in the Russian imperial narrative, everybody is a fascist. Everybody who opposes Moscow rule was called a bourgeois nationalist or a fascist or now a neo-Nazi. But the OUN incorporated the word nationalism into its title, into its name, and its ideology did differ. How did it differ? Well, first of all, they were programmatically extreme right, what we would call today extreme right, meaning they were anti-democratic, anti-parliamentary, anti-liberal, pro-dictatorship. They threw the word demo-liberal, Democrat and liberal, at others as an insult. Even at the previous generation, the generation of the Chervona Kolina, the Січові the people who fought for independence 1917 to 1920. True, and I agree with what Professor Matej said, this ideological choice was made in a context. They considered a national state, winning a national state as the primary goal, and recognized that you had to have an army, you had to have a military. There would be a military struggle. But at the same time, they did, in their program, the first item on their program said they were for a totalitarian state. So that becomes part of the ideology. And when, just before the Second World War, they moved into a different kind of sphere. They became pro-German in many respects, pro-dictatorship for sure. They supported various dictators in Europe, but also they became more anti-Semitic in their propaganda. To the best of my knowledge, neither wing of the OUN said anything about the murder of Jews prior, during, or after the Second World War. Now, you can debate whether whether ideology is really that important. Many people joined the OUN not for ideological reasons, but simply because they wanted to fight the Soviets or the Poles. And also you can say that within the OUN, as I found out when I wrote my book on Ukrainian nationalism, there was an internal debate. And many people at the top said, why are we writing this in our propaganda? What are we talking about when we speak about getting rid of the Jews or moving the Jews out? Who needs this? So ideology is very often used against the OUN, but people don't go deeply into understanding the tensions within and the discussions within the OUN about that ideology. Then there is political alignment. The OUN moved, as has been said, towards a pro-German approach. And of course, they hoped that the Germans would allow them to create a state. There were two small battalions created, the Nachtigall and Roland, 300 people approximately each. They were removed after 4 weeks because of insubordination. But that has been used against the OUN as an example of their pro-German views. Also, we know that when the Germans invaded in 1941, there were arches set up welcoming the Germans with portraits of Bandera and Hitler. And this becomes the compromising material that is used to show pro-German, pro-Nazi, pro-fascist views. Then there is the military action, or the politics of violence. Already we've heard about 1941. We've heard about the Volyn massacres of 1943, but also the killing of other nationalists, primarily members of the OUN, the Melnik faction, which is well documented. I mean, they were killing off competitors because the idea was to create a one-party state. As for the Volyn massacres, leading historians have now said that this was not only a huge mistake, but it was a terrible event. Ihor Ilyushin, Yaroslav Herzak, Yaroslav Dashkevich, and even Volodymyr Vyatrovich agree that a decision was taken to ethnically cleanse the Poles. So when we look back on this history, we have to live with these facts. We have to live with this ugly side of the history. I agree entirely that there was a change after 1943. The organization OUN-dominated UPA came to a different program, an anti-totalitarian program, and a program with a pro-Western orientation. And it tried to create a governing structure, the UHVR, Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, which was organized in 1944 as a kind of a government in the underground. I think that change was genuine. And we see, as has been said, from the writings of Petro Poltava, from Osip Hornovi, from the memoirs of Lev Shankovsky, who pointed out in his Pohidni Grupe OUN, that the OUN propagandists learned when they came to eastern and central Ukraine, there was strong resistance from the people to any talk of totalitarianism and to any talk of Ukrainian fury. We also have to recall that in 1943, it became clear to many people that Germany was losing the war. So a change of orientation occurred. But the next phase of the struggle, 1944 to 1947, mainly in the Zakarzonia, the lands along the Curzon line, separating Poland and Ukraine, contemporary Poland and Ukraine, that was in many ways a heroic struggle. The remnants of the UPA joined with locals who were resisting massive deportation to Ukraine and to the northern and western parts of Poland. And the local people joined with the UPA fighters in a very strong struggle that lasted for 2 years, 3 years, until pretty much all of those communities were gotten rid of, were deported. The ideology then became not only, it was double-voiced, it was a dual ideology. From the UPA, it was independent Ukraine, we have for an independent Ukraine, but from the locals, it was resistance to deportation. They didn't want to be thrown off their ancestral lands. Now, that last phase has frequently been remembered in post-war literature, art, memoirs, in immigration, and now in Ukraine as heroic, a heroic but doomed struggle. So today, when we talk about this pantheon, creating a pantheon of national heroes, which is what Ukraine is doing, because it's in a struggle, it needs military heroes, it needs the image of strong fighters. We have to decide who goes into that pantheon. Who are the icons, who are the portraits, who are the people? And we also have to get a better understanding of the history. Sometimes that means distancing oneself from aspects of that history. I'll just use one example. Dmytro Dontsov was an admirer of Hitler, Mussolini, and interwar dictators. He was a racist, a fascist, a politically loose cannon. Even the OUN leadership could not stand him. He refused to join any party, but he worked during the German occupation for Reinhard Heydrich's Institute in Prague, published a book, a very racist commentary called Duch Naszej Dawniny, in which he divided Ukrainians into 4 racial types: Nordic, Mediterranean, Dinaric, Oriental, Ostisica, Rasa. Even leaders of the OUN broke with him. Major writers like Leonid Mosenz, who idolized him in the 30s, broke with him. So did Yuri Klano Burkhardt, so did Ulas Samchuk, Yuri Lipa. All these are major so-called nationalist writers from the 30s. They all distanced themselves from Dontsov. So my question is, why does a person like Serhiy Kvit idolize Dontsov? Why is he trying to portray him as a liberal, a Democrat, a great figure to be emulated? I think that attitude to the uncritical attitude to the creation of a pantheon has to change. As has been said, Ukrainian history in the 30s and 40s is very complicated. It's multifaceted. It's also fascinating. It has much to teach post-colonial studies, decolonization, which is now popular, national liberation. But only if the lessons learned are done through honest and careful examination of sources. We need a serious work of understanding, and that's, I think, on the agenda. I have to stop there because I'm sure you have things to ask, things to say. So please feel free to join the conversation.
Будь ласка, чи є запитання, are there any questions from the audience, either in English або по-українськи, як хочете, as you like. Володимир.
Yeah, I was about to do it in Yuki. Я думав взяти українські мові, тому що ще не приїхав з України. І навіть мали таку дискусію над тим, де diskutували. But I'm going to do it in English because I'm doing reference to some of the stuff that I personally was involved in. Some of the work that I did with Cossack, material that Cossack sent me on Ukraine and the Third Reich. Apparently, something that did appear not only in Ukrainian, but appeared in English with real documents. We used it at a conference we just did, about a month ago or 2 months ago. Interesting, the reference here, we were talking about Kherson and national, and our boys working in Kherson and Russian occupation, and here we had material from OUN being chased around Kherson in 42, not 43, 42. In Kherson, it turns out that Stefan Vendetta phones me and says, well, that was my uncle, Bodan Vendetta, that was down there. So what's interesting is context. I realize that in some ways it's absolutely right. And when it comes to Donso, Dr. Shkamri, I have a tendency to agree that, and a lot of us have a tendency to agree with that. But when it comes to the confession about 38 to 41, we have to be very careful. John Burrell actually taught me that when he basically said that 1941, when we did what we did, and we did it early, and confronted the Germans, and then all got arrested, we turned out to be the only nation that didn't really have, the French had Pétain, the Norwegians, God love all of them, but they had Quisling. The folks next door had, in Slovakia, had pizza, but we actually ended up not having a collaborationist government. That's interesting. Hunchak then picks up on that, and Hunchak, along with a very good friend of mine from the Cold War period, and I will enter the Cold War period, Romerstein, who wrote a very important article that dealt with this, pointed out the 3 things that are very important to this discussion. One, in Nuremberg, if in fact, OUN, for that matter, if Divizia, and Lechuk makes that point all the time, if OUN or Divizia were in fact as collaborationists as everybody says they are, and used monuments and all this damage that's being done, then that would have been brought up in Nuremberg. Because at that time, the Soviets were really strong and insistent on what they were doing. Instead, Romerstein had the theory that as a result of the 70s, and he wrote this, I was not a co-author, but I certainly did a lot of work with him on this. He wrote that it's in the 70s and 80s, when the Soviets were really scared of the possibility of the Jewish refuseniks and the Ukrainian nationalists finding a road, that you suddenly have this burst of energy, enormous burst of energy and a lot of material that suddenly appears. And so that's interesting because a character called Gomornsky has just picked up on that and picked up on a lot of what Romerstein wrote in his article. One of the points that Alexander, you talked about, whether it's 2,000, all of them, even if there was 20, that was very bad news. And we should bitch that there was a pogrom. But the one thing that Romerstein made it clear, he made it clear that at no point did any of the organizations, any of the factions of OUN call at that point, officially called for pogrom. There was none with this when it comes to the Lviv. That's one thing he made confirm. Second, He said, when it comes to Nakhtagad and the Rayan, very interesting. He says, Canaris is now nearly, and Gomorrah has actually gone further than Romerstein. He says, it's interesting that if, in fact, Nakhtagad and the Rayan was created by Canaris and by Oberlander, and it turns out, and this is where we have to, even as historians, you have to take that responsibility. We're scared of that third rail about talking about German factions, that there was an Abwehr faction that was really actually relatively anti-Nazi. They were anti-Russian because it was Russia versus Germany, but they were also anti-Nazi. And those characters who now have been glorified in movies, the Canaris group, you see the movie with Tom Cruise and so on and so forth, Valkyrie and so on, have been glorified as attempting to assassinate. And we're hearing even that the Canaris people, men at the end of the war, gave all the information about rocketry. And yet they have now been unsanctioned. Oberlander has been unsanctioned, and yet Shukhevych ended up being sanctioned. It also turns out that in that same Gomorrah article, very recently written, he says that thing that they used, that he went to Belarus with a Karayina battalion, it turns out it wasn't, and it turns out that he ran away from it, and it turns out that there's now a document that old Gomorrah, printed in Times of Israel, shows that Shukhevych ended up on a most wanted list of SDAT, and at a relatively early period of time, 42, 43. So to make a long story short, the very fact, and Chandra brought this up to me because his father was foreign minister in the Carpatsko-Ukraine, as early as 39, we knew, and guys like Shukhevych who fought there knew that Horthy, and I was about to think of Orban now, but Horthy was an anti-fascist. Was a fascist. It was their version of fascist. And he sided with Germany, and Germany backed him in Carpatsko-Ukraine. To what extent would have Shukhevych then suddenly, and Stichko, the youngsters, have been pro-German? If anything, they might have been situational. But to be really ideologically firm with them is another question. So I'm really sorry that I took as much time as I did, but I've actually written stuff about when Huchak, his wonderful essays about this have raised this. I've worked with Romerstein on his articles, and so I know that in some ways, those things, including the touchy stuff of were they good Germans? Nobody can say there were ever any good Germans, but there was a difference between the Everniki and the Nazi Party, which was as racist as all hell and stuff like that, and literally thought that we needed third-grade education, so now fourth-grade education. So sorry about taking so much time, but I thought that this part also ought to be done.
Well, I just mentioned that the reason why Nachtigall and Roland were kept secret was because they knew that Hitler had stated no Ukrainians should carry arms. There should be no Ukrainian forces. So Canaris did this quietly in secret, outside the knowledge of the High Command. And
so our difficulty, thank you for making that point, because the difficulty with us is if we mention in public that there might be, there might have been Germans that were not quite Nazi and stuff like that, or were less Nazi and stuff like that, then you get into this, Jesus Christ, you've touched the third rail. There were no good Germans. So, in effect, man, that we face that as well. I mean,
so I just wanted to make a brief comment. If you look comparatively, every country, whether it has a state or whether it doesn't have a state, has moderates and radicals.
Yes.
And the moderates always criticize the radicals, and the radicals always criticize the moderates. And then if you look within the radical movements, whether they're communist or nationalist or fascist or whatever, they're always radicals and moderates. So I would just bring to your attention the PLO under Arafat was moderate.
Yes.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was radical. What happened between the two groups? The PLO killed the PFLP, and the PFLP killed PLO. the Popular Front for the Liberation of Algeria, Front de Libération, whatever the name was. There were camps set up for Algerian refugees in Paris, near Paris. And this was during the war. The FLN infiltrated the camps and killed its opponents, who were generally the moderates. The same is true of the IRA. There are the moderates, and of course, they're still killing each other, aren't they? Now, this is all very unfortunate, and we may criticize it, but it happens to be the way these things work, both within the larger society and then within the nationalist movements within. You always have these sorts of issues, and they almost always end up in some form of violence. So the OUN is really, the extraordinary thing about the OUN is that it is extremely ordinary. It is really exactly like every other nationalist movement I can think of. I think we can take one more question, останнє питання, and then I think we need to break. Так, будь ласка.
I have heavy accent in English. Can I speak
Так,
in
так, будь ласка,
Ukrainian? Отже, я відносилася до правозахисного руху в 60-х-80-х років. І що я хочу сказати і натиснути на це, що робила пропаганда не тільки в жовтні, а в кожній газеті було Бандера і Шептицький. Шептицький і Бандера. Це у всіх газетах. Воно так як било, як молотком по голові. Окрім того, я в правозахисному русі займалася своєю спеціальністю нищення пам'яток історії і культури. Ніхто не говорить про це. Є пейзаж Івана Труша. За його будинком Штрека і було жидівський цвинтар. Зруйнували його в 53-52 році. Щось таке. Я тоді була дуже мала. Я недалеко мешкала, і ми з дочкою Труша були в контакті. Про те, що Шептицький захистив енну кількість жидівських дітей, я не знаю скільки. Я це довідалася від свого вихователя, отця Клюса, який фінансовою стороною при Шептицькому віддав. Він їх захистив, і про це ніхто не говорить. Ну, дуже мало, скажімо. Це просто на це треба натискати. Остання синагога у Львові, яка була знищена, це в 53-му році, вона знаходилася на Лівандівці. Це радянський період. Бо я ранішого періоду, крім того, що я приятелювала з Галиною Захарясевич-Липою, якого вбили після того, як він кесарів розтин прийняв дитину. То це також дуже мало говорять. Я про це знала, довідалася від Галини Захарясевич-Липи. І Марта Скорубська редагувала про Юрія Липу книжки, і вона з моїх слів про це написала. На подвір'ю зразу, як